Commissioners, that moves you on to your next item on your agenda, which is item 2.09, briefing and update on the Charles County Disparity Study. And we have Ms. Lucretia Freeman-Buster here to introduce the topic.
Good
Lucretia.
morning, commissioners. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good morning, commissioners. This is Lucretia Freeman-Buster, Chief of Business Development, and it's a pleasure to introduce the Griffin and Strong team, Dr. Rodney Strong and also Michele Clark Jenkins. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
And if you're ready, I can share your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. I'm Rodney Strong. I'm the chairman of Griffin and Strong. We're a law and public policy consulting firm. And Michele Clark Jenkins is our project manager who managed the project for Charles County. She's extremely knowledgeable of all the details of this, and she's going to be our primary presenter. I'm here to support her and also will be available for any questions. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Clark Jenkins. You need to unmute, Michele.
Again, thank you for allowing us to finally present this. You know, we've been working with your team to complete the study. We want to thank particularly Lucretia Freeman-Buster and Lucinia Mundy. They were part of our team and integrated with us. So first slide, please. So just a reminder as to the process of the disparity study. It's why it took a year, is because there are a lot of moving parts to it. We did a legal analysis. We did a purchasing practices, policies, and procedures. So we went through, what it is that you currently have written policy. We also did interviews to determine whether everyone understood the policies and also whether there was any difference between written policy and practice. We spent a lot of time collecting and cleaning data before we ran any analysis. We also reviewed that data as a summary before we began the analysis. We did a relevant market analysis, which is what is the geographic area that we're studying, as well as the product markets. We then did utilization, where and with whom are you spending your dollars, availability analysis, who are the ready, willing, able firms in the relevant market area, and then the disparity analysis, which is the comparison of the two. Private sector analysis, which is a little bit of a misnomer. It's actually a marketplace disparities analysis of outside of what you're spending, what does the rest of the relevant market look like? We also did extensive collection of anecdotal evidence. We did informational meeting. We did public hearings, focus groups, surveys, talk to organizations, and we also accepted email comments. And then finally, our report. Next slide, please. So let's start with kind of the basics again. It's always good to have a refresher on what is a disparity study. It's an objective research tool that determines whether a governmental agency has a factual predicate to adopt race and gender conscious policies in its procurement. And a factual predicate, and I'll mention more about that in a minute, is based on substantial disparities in participation compared to what might be expected given the availability of firms in the marketplace, passive participation in substantial disparities within the marketplace. In other words, it's not your spend, but what's happening in the marketplace shows those disparities. And so passively, you're participating in that. And then whether race and gender disparities persist after we control for other race and gender neutral factors. So in other words, once we find that disparity, when we kind of eliminate the other explanations for the disparity, is race and gender still present as a likely cause? And then we have supportive, qualitative, which is anecdotal evidence. So the findings of the disparity study resulted in recommendations by our study team, and we're hoping that if they're accepted, they'll be implemented as policy. Next slide, please. So the legal basis for the disparity study is this case in which is actually in your circuit, the Fourth Circuit, which started everything. This case of City of Richmond, Virginia versus J.A. Croson. That was followed by the Adirondack case, and then the controlling case presently in the Fourth Circuit where you are is H.B. Rowe versus Tippett. Our principal investigator, Dr. Vince Egan, was the successful expert witness that defended this case, which was a case against the state program for NC, North Carolina Department of Transportation. So this Richmond, Virginia case required, really for the first time, that in doing some societal remediation of discrimination or past discrimination, that was kind of treated on by the court on the same level that malevolent discrimination had been treated. In other words, what the court really said is that the 14th Amendment says everybody has to be treated equally. And so whether that's because you're remediating something or because there's some sort of malevolent discrimination. So the court has a standard to overcome any race and gender conscious remedies or race or gender conscious programs. You have to overcome the judicial scrutiny, which was strict scrutiny, which some of you know means strict in theory, fatal in fact. So in order to overcome that, you have to have a factual basis in evidence, which the disparity study is, depending on its outcome. And then you have to have a narrowly tailored remedy, which means our recommendations have to be tied to the findings of our study. Next slide, please. So here were our study parameters. We looked at all of your procurement from fiscal year 2015 through 2019. We disaggregated the data into 4 categories: construction, architecture and engineering, or construction-related professional services, other services, and goods. We did an analysis of your relevant market area, which is where you're already spending during that study period at least 75% of your dollars. And so we start with Charles County, and then we start to pull out, kind of radiate out from Charles County until we pass that 75% threshold. And that turned out to be your CSA, the Washington, Baltimore, Arlington, DC, MD, VA, WV, PA consolidated statistical area. Next slide, please. And that's kind of the map of that area. I think it covers a little bit, goes a little bit into Pennsylvania, goes a little bit into West Virginia. So availability, which is one of the most controversial parts of a disparity study, is who are those ready, willing, and able firms. So we look at really 3 qualifications. One is that they've demonstrated interest in doing business with government by registering, certifying, actually doing business, bidding. In some way, they've come to government to do business. They're located within the relevant geographic market, and they actually perform services in areas that you are purchasing from, either goods or services. We do deal with capacity, which is the ability to perform the work. We test that in the regression analysis, and that shows whether, but for race or gender factors, firms would be able to perform on county work. We also did some other capacity controlling activities in looking at smaller contracts. So, there's the argument, well, can these firms They may be able to do a small contract, but can these firms do, $20 million contracts? Well, your median and your average contracts are not $20 million contracts. You have a substantial percentage. Matter of fact, the majority of your contracts are much smaller contracts, under $200,000. Next slide, please. So here was really the outcomes by each category. And let me just kind of explain these columns to you. So this is the construction analysis. So the first column really sets out the ethnicity or gender category. The next one is the percentage of dollars that were spent over the full study period in that area. These are prime plus subcontractors combined. So we looked at if there was a prime, let's say there was a non-minority prime contractor who had $1 million contract, and they subcontract out 300,000 of that to my various minority firms. We subtracted that money out and put it in the right categories as to where it ultimately ended up. So that's the percentage of dollars, both prime and sub, that were spent. Then we have the percentage of available firms in each of those categories. And then the disparity index is really the comparison of the two. Then the next to the last column is whether we found underutilization or overutilization based on the comparison of the two. And then you'll see that last column has a star in it. We considered that anything that is less than 80%, so in that column that has the disparity index, if you're 80 or less, you would be considered statistically significantly underutilized. If you see a blank there, it's either overutilization, or if you were underutilized, it wasn't statistically significant. So in construction, you'll see that in every category except Asian American owned firms, there was underutilization of each group except the control group, which is non-MWBEs.
I have a question.
Yes.
While we're on that slide. So what did you find when, I guess, these contracts went out? Were they using, I guess, the best price? Because that's where I'm trying to, was it the best price that was given, and the ability to do the job was the major determining factor on who got the job? Did you find that, or what did you find?
So our comparison is really of the ultimate outcome. So we don't look at how the process worked. We look at the ultimate outcome. So we don't look at what kind of bid it was. We don't look at what kind of, in other words, all the nuances of how a procurement operated. We looked at the end of the day where you spent your dollars. So it's a pretty simple comparison, which is where did your dollars ultimately go, no matter how that procurement operated? Where did those dollars ultimately go? And then we looked at, we did do some regression analysis. We looked at some of the reasons for that, like, let's say the size of the firms, comparison size of the firms, how long they've been in business, education of the owner. We equalized all that out in a regression analysis to determine whether, so in other words, what we did, it's like comparing apples to apples. So if you have non-minority firms who have certain level of education compared to minority and women-owned firms who have a certain level of education, did they have equal outcomes? Size of firms. If you have large firms who are compared to other large firms, did they have equal outcomes? If you had, so there were a number of categories that were taken into account in the regression analysis to kind of equalize all that out in terms of the status of firms.
And that's and the reason I asked that is because, to me, when I look at how our procurement works, I would think and hope that the most important thing for staff to look at is to stretch the taxpayer's dollar. So if they're looking at, when they bid these contracts, the person that has the ability, first, they can do the job, and second, the absolute best price, because, you know, as far as budgets go, you know, everybody wants a piece of the pie. So if they're trying to stretch the taxpayer dollar as far as they can get it, is that the basis? I guess that's a question for staff. If they're just using who has the best price and the ability to do the job, then that's how they're looking at it. They're not looking at it through the way you're looking at it. That's, I guess, what I'm asking. So
Commissioners, just a point of reference, let's allow the completion of the actual presentation. Then we'll have ample opportunity to ask questions, because quite frankly, some of the questions you may be asking are a part of the actual report itself. So if you could, you know, let's allow Ms. Clark Jenkins an opportunity to complete her presentation. I certainly have questions. I think all of us do, but at least we'll have a better context in terms of asking the questions directly, and for the sake of time, so we can kind of expedite this as well.
If you could just pin that question for me, so when we get to the end, we can revisit. Thank you so much for allowing me to ask that question.
Okay. So now we're on A&E. So A&E, again, we have, if you look at the comparison of available firms in the marketplace compared to the percentage of dollars spent with each of those categories, and again, it's disaggregated by ethnicity and gender, you have statistically significant underutilization of each of the MWBE groups: African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, Native American, and non-minority females. We did have a category that was unidentified MWBEs. In other words, they're firms that we knew they were MWBEs, but we couldn't figure out the exact ownership, so we still counted them in kind of this catch-all category. But in each one of those categories, there was statistically significant underutilization. Next slide, please. In other services, we had a similar outcome when you looked at the percentage of dollars spent with each race and gender group compared to the percentage of available firms. You had statistically significant underutilization in each of those groups. Total minority in other services was 4.8% dollars compared to 24.8% availability. So again, whenever that disparity index is less than 80, you're going to have a statistically significant underutilization. So the closest to zero is the more statistically significant the underutilization is. Next slide, please. In goods, similar outcome, non-minority female-owned firms were underutilized, but it was not statistically significant. If you'll notice it was not under 80, but it was less than 100, and 100 is parity. So if you saw 100, it would mean, in essence, that availability equals utilization. Next slide, please. So our overall finding was that we found statistically significant underutilization in prime contracts, and actually subprime plus sub, for all MWB groups except Asian American owned firms in construction and non-minority female owned firms in goods, but they were underutilized but not statistically significant. Non-minority, non-MWBE firms were overutilized in every category. So we made recommendations, and probably before I go into the recommendations, we had a couple of commendations, which I'll just mention. One is that when we do these disparity studies around the country, we many times find that bonding and insurance are a big issue. You know, when we go out to do particularly anecdotal they bring that up over and over and over again. That did not happen here. So we commend the county on really the lack of complaints about bonding and insurance, which we hear a lot out, when we're doing these disparity studies. Also, the other thing we always hear a lot about is lack of prompt pay. Again, the counties should be commended that we heard very few complaints about late payments by the county or by prime contractors, which means your prime contractors seem to also be paying your subs on time. And we also want to commend you on some of your business development efforts. The county has a micro loan program, the small business workshops like your SLBE certification, management assistance, resource opportunities, and the partnership program for small businesses with the SBA, SBDC, and the Southern Maryland Minority Chamber of Commerce and the Governor's Office on Small Minority and Women Business Affairs. So want to first take that before we get into our other recommendations is to commend the county on those steps. So our first recommendation based upon the study is to enhance this, your SLBE program where you have this race neutral small local business enterprise set aside program. We took a look at that program that you already have and really think that that is a great program, but it needs to be enhanced. Clearly, we have deep disparities, and so we're going to give you a number of tools in your toolbox, some of them race and gender neutral, but there is a basis for you to have some race and gender conscious programs. We don't think that race and gender neutral programs alone will work to remediate the deep disparities we saw. But we do think that there can be some benefits to kind of beefing up that program that you currently have. That local small business set aside is for contracts that are 25,000 or less. But there were only, and although the county spent about $34 million in awards under that $25,000 threshold, only 1.37 million, so a little more than $1 million, actually went out as part of that set aside program. And so you have 500, the US Census showed that you have 5,024 minority firms and 4,220 women-owned firms located in the county. But these only went out to 318 awards. So, and these are ones that were over $100, but less than 25,000. So we do think it's a good idea. You have been using a requirement that there be at least 3 firms in the county. So it's not just giving a contract to it, but there have to be at least 3 SLB firms in contention in the county. And that's a really good thing to have in place. But we think that there's a lot more you can do with that program to bring in, particularly to bring in more firms who get certified as SLBE. So a lot of that is outreach. We also recommend, there are 2 types of goals. One is an aspirational goal, which is more internal. The other is a requirement subject to good faith efforts that you put on prime contracts in terms of them securing subcontracts. So we did recommend a race and gender conscious MWBE contract by contract goal with a robust good faith efforts. What that means is that on a contract by contract basis, you set a goal based on that project. So we may have, for example, in construction, it may say that 25% in construction are minority-owned firms. What we're suggesting is that you not just apply that to every contract as a requirement, but that in fact you look contract by contract on the availability of firms for those scopes of work. So if you have, and that's in order to have your goals be narrowly tailored. So let's say, for example, you have a 25% overall goal in construction, but now you're doing a contract that's demolition and blasting. Well, in demolition and blasting, and there's an equation for this very similar to what's done in the DBE, federal DBE program. Let's say the outcome of that really shows that you have a 10% availability of minority-owned firms in between blasting and demolition. Well, then applying a 20% goal or a 25% goal to that would not be narrowly tailored. The opposite's true. You could have that kind of a goal and then find out that really the minority availability on certain scopes of work, for example, hauling, which we know is a really high area for minority-owned firms, could be 30%. And so you want to make sure you're doing a narrowly tailored requirement, because the outcome of these kinds is the prime must meet those goals, or they must demonstrate good faith efforts. In other words, they demonstrate that they really did try, couldn't find anybody, couldn't get anybody, everybody was already booked up. So whatever the criterion, we provide some criteria for that, or they are deemed non-responsive. So you want to make sure that good faith efforts is applied. The second kind of goal is your annual aspiration. So your good faith, those specific contract by contract goals would likely be set, and that's a conversation for implementation, but would likely be set on larger contracts. So on the smaller contracts and those that aren't subject to this specific contract by contract goals would then still have aspirational goals. So those are the ones where that you've had kind of already, where you say to the prime, here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get to these. You tell us how you're going to help us reach these goals. But if they don't do it, there's not a penalty of not being awarded the contract. Next slide, please. We also suggest that you strengthen contract compliance. A huge amount of seeing success in this area is not just doing things like setting goals, but you've also got to carry through from really the beginning of the procurement process, assessing who's out there, who are the firms specifically. I mean, we're giving you numbers, and we're giving you data files, but who are the firms out there specifically that you know with an upcoming bid who can perform those services? Getting to know those firms who are within your relevant market, who you probably don't already know. So assessment and looking at the capacity of individual firms. Outreach is part of strengthening your contract compliance. Like we talked about the SLBE program, you're going to strengthen that program by doing more outreach. Certification, we're not suggesting that you do certification, but you want to get more firms certified at MDOT, through MDOT, as well as in your own SLBE program. Also, there's just the procurement itself. You want to make sure that your compliance team is involved with the procurement process from the very beginning. And then monitoring is huge. If you don't monitor this, it's been our experience that firms will say, well, I'm going to give this subcontractor 10% of the work in this particular area, and then that never happens. So if you're not watching and you're not monitoring and tracking this participation, and by the way, not just of minority and women-owned firms, you should be doing that of all subcontracting work, because there's no way to know how firms are doing, or even minority and women-owned firms are doing, if you don't know how all subcontractors are doing. So you should be tracking all of that work. The next recommendation was the elimination or limiting the use of on-call contracts. Really not saying eliminate them in the sense that you have people, the necessity of doing on-call contracts is obviously, water main breaks, or you've got sewage work, but really examining that to see if they're necessary. We did see some areas where it appeared that, it's particularly when you're seeing something like engineers, professional services like engineers who may have ongoing on-call contracts. That eliminates the ability for particularly minority and women-owned firms and other firms as well to come in and have the ability to compete for those individual contracts. That's really the point here, which is where possible you want competition, and not just, this kind of open-ended contract for a firm to keep coming in and doing the same work over and over again without bidding it out. We've really, and again, I've talked a number of times about this outreach improvement. We just think that when we started talking to firms within your relevant market, there really was a misunderstanding about Charles County being open for business to them, particularly as minority and women-owned business. We heard some people give us history saying, well, we didn't feel like this was a place that was open for us. One gentleman said to us that he had grown up in the area just outside the county, and that when they went fishing, they avoided coming through Charles County, that there was that kind of history, but they understand now that that history has changed and that Charles County is a brand new place that's open for business for everyone. But still, when you have firms who go, well, we didn't even know that there were opportunities in Charles County. We heard that over and over again. So it's really that campaign that says we're open for business, come do business with Charles County. And then our next recommendation, next slide, please, was forecasting. Again, the sooner firms know that something is up for bid, the sooner they can prepare to bid. We did hear a lot of anecdotal about kind of an informal network. So firms who know about things, firms who've been doing business keep getting the same contracts over and over again. Same firms keep doing business with them over and over again. And so one way also to kind of cut that a little bit is that all firms come on equal footing in terms of knowing what's coming up, rather than this kind of inside, well, they knew about it 6 months ago because they already do business with the county. If the county begins to put out forecasting, we would recommend at least a year ahead of time, even if it's not a specific solicitation, that you're able to say we're going to be doing some coming up in the next year. So firms can begin to think about joint venturing and teaming. And that's been an area that's been very successful in promoting those two things. And then ultimately, our final recommendation was data reform. We had a lot of trouble with data in terms of what you're maintaining and the way it's being maintained. So specifically, subcontractor data is to make sure that you are tracking and monitoring all of the subcontractor commitments and payments. That's both MWBE and non-MWBE. Awards were difficult for us to figure out awards. That's why we did utilization based on payments, but you also want to be able to aggregate those and understand the history of your awarding. So we want to see you track amendments and status changes of contracts, not just the original contract, which is subject to change a lot. So we'd like to see some cohesive tracking of awards, and then the intentional use of commodity codes. The commodity codes are very useful, but they're only useful if you intentionally assign them. So seeing, a lot of contracts being just put into general categories. So it's really looking at intentionally using those commodity codes. So also this vendor registration, you don't have really a full a vendor registration. And we really think that would be a good idea, particularly to have bidders register as vendors. So you have that kind of record of not just firms who have been paid, but you have a record of firms who have bid and firms who want to do business with you. Right now, they kind of have to come directly through MDOT in order to see, or through the state marketplace. But there's not really a registry of firms with the county. And we think that would be a good idea for you to have that. So the next steps is to implementation is once the disparity study and its recommendations are accepted, to look at what needs new authorization and what enhancements can be made to existing programs without further authorization or legislation, drafting a new program plan, planning for implementation, determining budget and staffing needs, and then developing a training protocol and training staff. So again, 5 steps to contract compliance. That's really important to implementation. The assessment of individual firms, outreach, letting the community know that you want to do business with them and that you're willing to work with those firms to create opportunities, encourage and assist firms to get certified with the state of Maryland, as well as on your SLBE program, looking at the procurements, debundling of contracts, if they're really large contracts, is there a way to split them up? And of course, monitoring from beginning to end on that procurement. So that's our presentation. Now I'm open to those questions. And I go back to the question that was already on the floor, which is about looking at procurement. So a disparity study doesn't look at individual procurements. It looks at the overall outcomes of all of them together, no matter how you've done it. Because part of the issues many times is the procurement process itself, the type of procurement, how a procurement's done. So kind of the purest way to look at this is to look at the ultimate outcomes. And I think that Commissioner Bowling, that you were looking at, well, these individual procurements and how they're done and what's required of those individual procurements. That we look at the big picture. At the end of the day, what's the ultimate outcome of all the different ways that the county's conducting its procurement? At the end of the day, what's the ultimate outcome? That's why we don't disaggregate by types of procurements. We look at the overall outcome. And then we look at, because we're really looking at the success of firms, really, when you look at it. So why is this firm succeeding when this firm's not? When they have equal qualifications, let's look at it that way, equal qualifications. So the regression analysis takes some of those and kind of compares them. So size of firm, that education of the owner, how many employees they have, how long they've been in business, all of those things. When you compare individual ethnicities and genders to the control group, which is non-MWBEs, and you don't see a difference between them, in essence, then why is there a difference in the outcome? So that's really what a disparity study looks at, and our methodology. I absolutely agree that there are some things in our methodology that may be counterintuitive on some levels, but this is established the court in Croson really said, here's what we have to see for you to demonstrate to us that there's a need for race and gender conscious programs, for us to spend dollars that way. And then, but it didn't really tell us how to do it. So what's happened since 1989, when that case was decided, is that the various courts of appeal and circuit courts throughout the country have kind of said, yeah, you have to do that. No, you can't do that. No, we don't like that. Yes, we do like that. And that's become the body of the methodology. So the methodology has been to say, and really, when you read the Croson case, one of the things it hones in on is, do we see these disparities persisting in certain industries? So so that's why also we spread it out, is, has there been some disparities and inferences of discrimination in the construction industry? And then how is the county combating that? And then how is the county spending its money in that industry? Is there a disparity overall? So we're not looking at every individual procurement and dissecting that. We're looking at the ultimate outcome and spend of the county.
No, and I appreciate, and I wanted to thank you for the presentation, because you gave a lot of data that was really important as we move forward. And I guess what I was getting at was currently the way when our procurement folks, when we approve a project for construction or whatever it may be, a good or services that we are trying to purchase through county funds, which is taxpayers' money. And maybe this is a good question for procurement if they're on the line. When we put that out for bid, is the sole criteria whoever can provide that service at the level we need for the best price? And so if our procurement is doing that now, then the outcomes, while I can see, and it's obvious that there's just a disparity of who's getting the contracts and who's being awarded them, if the initial award is not being based on anything other than the most competitive bid with the ability to do the job, it kind of I can see where if we're in a position which we need to have and attract more local and minority-owned businesses with our programs, that if we're going to set that as our criteria to kind of improve their involvement. So do you find where I'm going with this? I'm trying to understand if it's just, and I guess Shana, because I can see you popped up. When we do our procurement, is it solely based on the best price for the ability to serve the purpose of the contract and nothing else?
So we do have two procurement methods. One is the RFP process, which is based on an evaluation and price. And then the scenario you're discussing is an invitation to bid process, competitive sealed bidding. And in that, the determining factor first is the low price, and then responsible vendor based on qualifications and other information, bonding, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Yes.
So Ms. Clark, I guess what I'm gathering from this presentation is we have an opportunity to increase minority and women involvement in our process through, I guess, maybe like education and making the process more available for them, not necessarily changing the criteria, but making it so that folks have an opportunity to bid these more and have an opportunity to, I'm trying to think of the word for it. I'm kind of getting what you're saying but you're not saying that there's necessarily I want to say disparity. There's not necessarily discrimination going on in the process, but the outcomes and the results of the outcome of who's getting the bid, it shows us room for improvement when it comes to the availability for people to bid on these projects. Is that kind of what you're saying to me?
Michele, do you mind, and Commissioner Bowling, if I could take an opportunity to begin to try to respond to some of what you're saying? I think we're all talking about the same thing, and we're talking, I think, in slightly different language. One of the things that Michele was doing in her presentation was talking about how it is from a legal standpoint, you can make a determination as to whether or not there is a basis for a remedial program to assist minority and women-owned businesses in the marketplace. And there has become a methodology for doing that in each of the circuits based on litigation that's occurred. For instance, in the Fourth Circuit, there was a lawsuit against the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and there were certain decisions that were made as part of that litigation. And so, when we're working in Maryland, we're looking to that case and some of the things it requires. And one of those things that it requires is a regression analysis. Another thing that it requires is a certain type of methodology that you use in terms of your availability analysis to say, yes, there is a basis. Now, what the courts look at, and there's a lot of language that's used in the popular culture, but in the courts, they're really looking at whether there is an inference, what they call, from a legal standpoint, an inference of discrimination. And that doesn't mean necessarily that the county itself is being discriminatory in its day-to-day administration of its procurement process. But what it means is that in the process overall in the marketplace, you're still observing the present effects of past discrimination or present discrimination. And so what that means is really this. If you're bidding something, there are going to be certain firms that, because of a history of discrimination in the marketplace, because there's been segregation in the school system, because there's been segregation in the relationships between people don't know each other over and across, racial, gender, ethnic lines in the same way. And so one of the things that the government looks at is whether or not you're opening up a process by which firms that are, say, subcontractors are being fairly considered. I think that when you peel back the layers, oftentimes, and we do this in a separate section of a disparity study called a public policies and practices review. We sort of look at how do you actually go out to bid for certain types of services, and what kinds of requirements do you place, and are there barriers in those requirements? We also do anecdotal evidence interviews. So we ask people, what are your experiences when you approach various firms about bidding with them? So we look more than just the statistics. The statistics are the threshold, and we use the statistics based on the methodology that has been approved, more or less. Approved is not the right term. That has been looked upon favorably by courts in the opinions in your circuit. So then when you get to this question of, okay, if it's an open competitive process, an ITB, an invitation to bid, then if you're just looking at low price, and low price is the only factor, and minority firms tend to not have the low price, what are the other factors that might go into that? And so when you peel back on that, sometimes you find that they're not getting the best pricing. Sometimes they're not getting the best pricing on their supplies. Sometimes there are other barriers that impact it. Sometimes people have just developed relationships with subcontractors that they are comfortable doing business with. I'm working right now on a matter where a company made a commitment that they were going to use minority businesses, but the owner of this particular grocery chain pre-approves all the firms that can work on their project as subcontractors, and they didn't have any minority businesses in this marketplace this particular marketplace that were pre-qualified. So you've got all of these factors that you're looking at, and I know I'm taking a long time, and I apologize for that, but I'm trying to explain.
No, you're doing good. You're explaining it to me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, but I'm trying to explain that it's once you get past the legal requirement or threshold to say there is a disparity and therefore something needs to be done to make a more fair marketplace, then the question becomes, what issues are you observing in that particular marketplace? And we get at that through those other analyses. And Michele, you can sort of pick up from there and talk about that.
So the only thing that I wanted to point out is in these low bid environments, which, most government has the low bid environment, there are other requirements. So there are requirements that make you a responsible and responsive bidder. So if you set a goal on a project and you say to a prime contractor, there's a goal of X percentage on this contract, 10% on a construction contract, and you need to fill that 10% with a minority or a woman-owned firm. then if that prime contractor comes back and has not satisfied that goal, which was part of the requirement, they would have to demonstrate, if they did not meet the goal, they would have to demonstrate that they used good faith efforts to try to meet that goal. And there are a number of criteria for what good faith efforts mean. They've made good faith efforts, or they're deemed non-responsive. So you don't even get to the issue of whether they're the lowest bidder because they're not responsive to the bid.
No, it makes sense, and I guess that's where I'm, and Mr. Strong, you explained it very well, so I understood where you were coming from and understand what you're saying as far as the process goes. And I think where the only concern would be, whereas if as a community we're trying to encourage women and minority-owned businesses to relocate to our county, I think it's important that we set policy in place, Mr. President, that if that is going to become a criteria for how we do business, then the part of that criteria is you have to be a Charles County minority-owned business. So that will attract and make those folks want to come to our county because we're being progressive in how we do things. So that's kind of my thought process in it. And like I said, I appreciate Ms. Strong. You explained it very well and made the point. So I understand it now. Thank you very much.
I know Commissioner Coates.
Yes, sorry. Okay, a couple things. I want to just start off. I'm going to start off where Commissioner Pohl left off. When we speak of minority businesses wanting to come to this county, first we have to make sure that, or doing business with minority business in this county, first we have to make sure that there's a market in the county for them to come to. So what you do is you block yourself in. So what you have is primes that will say, hey, I tried to look for a minority or MBE sub in the county, but we didn't have one. So now you're back to where you started, and that's the reason for this disparity study is because they will say we don't have a minority in that marketplace. So I don't know if I agree with just mapping ourselves into the county only, especially at this particular time where we just have a disparity study and we need to probably implement those recommendations first to try to get to incentivize those businesses to come first. And then we can lock in and say, you have to be part of the county once we get that market in here. One of the things that I wanted to also point out was Charles County has had an aspirational goal of 25% for many years. That's the reason for this disparity study. Again, if we were meeting those aspirational goals, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation, but they're not being met. And and I think it was pointed out today that those aspirational goals were not. And the disparity studies help facilitate us in pushing a little bit, that envelope a little bit more, saying that if you want to do business here, even if you're not a minority company that wins the contract, you must have some kind of goal, a minority MBE goal, in order to continue winning contracts in this county or winning contracts with county government. So I just want to point these things out, that it's not about only winning the bid. It's about when you win the bid, are you bringing in and meeting those goals of those minority companies, those MBE, women-owned and minority companies or firms? So I just want to point that out because I thank and appreciate you both, because you did shed a lot of light, and this is a really great study, and you did an excellent job in presenting it accurately. Thank you so much for that.
Well,
Commissioner Bowling, I got a couple of questions, but I wanted to give Bobby an opportunity. So
I'm good.
Right.
They answered mine.
Okay, Wes, you had a question?
Just a really quick one, and thank you. Ms. Clark Jenkins, did you, I know your study, you spoke in terms of minority and women businesses. Did you have, for each of the separate sectors, because I understand, or the way that I understand the Crossan and its progeny to read is that you have to identify each of the minority sectors. So for example, there could be a set aside for Hispanic or Latinx companies, there could be a set aside for Asian American companies, there could be a set aside for African American. Did your particular study identify any particular sector, or was it across all sectors?
Yeah, we did it by all of our analysis was disaggregated by each ethnic and gender group. So African American, Asian American owned firms, Hispanic, Native American, non-minority female, and then kind of the control group, which is non-MWBEs, which would have been made up of non-minority males, publicly held companies, that and in that group. So yes, we disaggregated the entire analysis by each ethnicity and gender group.
And did your disparity study find any places where it was not supported, or is it supported across all of the minority sectors? Is really what my ultimate question was.
Yeah, so the only places were in construction. The area was Asian American owned firms in construction were overutilized, and non-minority female owned firms were underutilized in, I believe, goods, but it wasn't statistically significant. But yes, in every other category, in every other ethnic group, there was statistically significant underutilization.
And just for the commissioners, based on that, if there were to be a program that were proposed by commissioners, they would have to exempt those two categories because the disparity study wouldn't find support in them. Is that how you understand it?
Likely, we'd have to, before we excluded a group, we'd also, there was some support in the private sector analysis, because the courts have said, even if you're in your own spend, there is not a statistically significant underutilization of a particular group. But when we look in the marketplace, there is a finding of discrimination, and those are an inference of discrimination in the private sector, that the county can be a change agent for that group and be able to include them in remedial programs. And so I think we would want to look closely in the implementation phase about whether it really is supported to exclude Asian American owned firms. But yes, to answer your question probably more simply, yes, that's the case.
Mr. President, I just have one more question. So I'm looking at the marketplace, and I guess where my concern, I think I said this before, is well, we would prioritize a business outside of the county. I guess in my mind, I'm thinking, if you're outside the county, we should be getting the best price. Now, if you're inside the county, then what we're talking about should apply. And I think, is that what this, if we put it in place, would it make it so that if a business was outside the county, that they could potentially get a contract not based on price and the taxpayer dollars, but it would be based on race? Is that what we're saying?
No, that's not what we're saying. So we haven't made any recommendation as to race and gender programs when it came, race and gender goals when it comes to prime contracting. If you'll notice, our recommendation when it comes to race and gender is subcontracting. And so, yes, what we're saying is that if you set a goal on a project where a prime has to meet a certain goal with its subcontractors, they could satisfy that goal, not just with firms inside of Charles County, but they could satisfy that with firms who are within that CSA, that whole relevant market. But secondarily, that does not prevent the county from having a totally separate program, which you already do have, which gives a certain kind of preference on top of whatever race and gender counting. In other words, you do a race and gender conscious program, and a firm comes from Washington, D.C., yes, they can count as satisfying that goal for race and gender because you're already spending your dollars in those areas. We didn't contrive the relevant market area. That was based upon where your dollars are already going. And we're saying when it comes to subcontractors, you can include minority and women-owned firms out that far. But you already have, in essence, a preference type program for local small businesses, and it doesn't keep you from having that. And I would suggest we loved when we looked at your SLBE program, we thought that was a really good program, and that's a race and gender neutral. So you could give preference outside of what we're talking about in terms of race and gender. You could give preference to local businesses if that was what the county wanted to do.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you both explaining, because this is a big study, and I'm just trying to understand the whole grasp of it. So thank you so much.
Great. And Ms. Clark Jenkins, Mr. Strong, just to follow up, because I think that was a very important point that you made, because what I see with your recommendations for implementation are the layering of some things that we already have in place and ideas to actually enhance what we're doing. And you kind of made that point on a regular basis. Just a couple of questions I had, because I think for the Board of Commissioners, obviously the process will include a more detailed discussion on implementation per se, actually thinking through what this will look like for us. But I think the study certainly confirmed what I believed anecdotally anyway. So we kind of understood this, and that's why it was important for the county to go through this exercise, to have a actual disparity study under our belt, so we can actually make these critical decisions based on where the law is at this point. And it limits the possibility of potential challenges to what we attempt to do. That's why we've gone through this, and we're working with a firm with the expertise, that Griffin and Strong has in place. So I just have, my question is really more so as it relates to the implementation process. And it is essentially based on your experience in conducting these studies. I wanted to get a sense from you on the success rate in terms of the jurisdictions that you've worked with in actually implementing the recommendations that you're suggesting. And the second question, as a follow-up to that, with where the county is right now, because we have to work through what this implementation plan will look like. I guess my second question is more in line with, can we begin on a level where we're, it may be more layered, but we're gradually getting to that point. Is that something that we could possibly do? Because it may be a heavy lift for the county to just implement everything in one brush, because I know it's going to likely include additional workforce, and quite frankly, just coordinating the various agencies that that are directly or indirectly a part of our procurement process. That may require some time. So again, the first question is, a sense from the expertise of your firm in actually assisting with the the actual implementation, the success rate, if you will. And then the second question, and as we move forward, if a plan can be put in place that may not necessarily be in one brush, we're able to implement it, but we're able to kind of gradually move. Because the data reform piece in particular, that's something that has been raised in the past, and I'm just curious about, would we have to wait, to have that entire data base exactly the way you suggest in order for us to move forward?
Rodney, you look like you were going to say something, but I'll jump in if.
No, I was thinking about saying something, but I think you better answer the last question you asked, because that's the most important one, I think.
Okay, yeah. So absolutely, we presume that jurisdictions have to kind of float into this and like you said, layer it. We're currently working through, and I'm happy to connect some of your staff or even the commissioners if you're interested. We are completing implementation phase with Frederick, Maryland, the city of Frederick, Maryland. We're also in the process of going through with two other counties, I think two, Rodney, right? With Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and Bexar County, Texas. We're also doing implementation phasing for the state of North Carolina. That we've been working on that one. State of North Carolina, literally we meet once a week, and we've been taking one thing, digesting one piece at a time, figuring out how the state, we have kind of their team, our team, and over a year, we're putting theirs into place. Some others are a little quicker. Frederick actually was a little quicker, but you do them in phases, because one of the things we recognize is when we finish these studies, if we think if there's a discussion of how to put this in place and it needs new staffing or more staffing, we may be way out of step with your budgeting process, when you're approving, new people. Also, if you're starting something new, you have to phase that in so that there's training and that people know what they're doing, that you want to make sure you have the resources before you kick anything in. So we presume that there's a phasing in of different aspects, and also just tweaking how that's going to work for you. We recommend the race and gender conscious subcontracting, but one of the things is, do you have the staffing right now? Do we need to start maybe with contracts, construction only contracts over $500,000, phase in other things over a period of years? I mean, or so all of that is done based on what your current resources are when we start the program and begin to phase in what makes sense. We are scheduled to have a discussion, I think, early next month with your team just about implementation. So, yeah, absolutely, it's phased in and it's layered in based on kind of what makes sense. What we don't want to see, and again, we do a lot of program development across the country. We don't want to see a rushed in program that's not going to work and is not going to be effective for anyone.
Yeah, and the only thing I was going to add, Mr. Chairman, is that we have had some success with governments, and a number of governments around the country who've made changes. But one of the things that really uh, stands out to us is when there's really a commitment to making the change and you're actually implementing it, the changes are pretty substantial. But and one particular government stands out in our minds because we conducted a disparity study. They only implemented a few of the recommendations, and then they came back and made a commitment to really, after doing a second disparity study, they came back and made a commitment to really implement all of the recommendations. And we worked with them on doing that, and they have actually become one of the stronger programs in the country. And so we've had, it really does require a commitment, because a lot of this is those things that Michele referenced earlier, which are basic contract compliance. You have to put in place a lot is helped when you do outreach. When you're making sure that you're doing outreach, make sure firms are aware. When you're actually monitoring, doing your contract administration, when you're forecasting, okay, we know a department has put in a budget item for a particular thing that they're going to be procuring next year. Are we making those firms that are in the marketplace aware that this procurement will come out at some point in the next fiscal year? The day-to-day monitoring of the jobs and the issues that people have on those jobs. All of those factors go into whether or not you're successful or not in terms of moving the needle, in terms of having a more equitable outcome.
Well, I mean, it's good to hear that, there will be a follow-up with staff and commissioners. As I stated, we will definitely have an opportunity to really weigh in on the policy level in terms of what this will look like. But I think without question, the work that was put into this disparity study was certainly in the best interest of the entire county. And I want to really set the record straight. Yes, many of us anticipated that there would be a degree, in this instance, an inference of discrimination was found. But I don't think any of us going into this didn't anticipate that was a likely outcome. what we should really focus on is the fact that the county made this commitment to actually doing a disparity study, showing a willingness to look at how we can make our procurement process fairer and one that ensures that every single resident that has an interest in doing business in Charles County is given, a fair option to do that. And I think we should commend the Board of Commissioners for taking this on, because it's never been done in the history of Charles County. And I would challenge, counties of our size that made this kind of financial commitment to this, because it's generally the larger, more urban jurisdictions that actually move on this. So, I think we should look at this as part of this board's being forward thinking and looking at the future of Charles County. And so, Ms. Clark Jenkins, thank you so much for your work, Mr. Strong. We appreciate that. I mean, my guess is this probably won't be the end of it, but we look forward to continued discussions with staff.
Thank you.
Ms.
So-
Hall.
I just want to, I really appreciate Michelle's comments earlier. I just want to recognize a couple of my staff, Lucretia and Lucinia, who headed up this project for a year. I kind of came in at the end. It was a very heavy lift, even for me. The last month when we got the recommendations, I literally had to read it multiple times and dissect it a couple of different ways to understand how we would implement it. And so I just want to recognize Lucretia and Lucinia for their hard work on this program. I couldn't let it go by without really recognizing economic development staff for the heavy lift. So thank you for indulging me, Commissioner Collins.
No problem. Thank you.
Well, commissioners, if there's no other questions, we're going to move on to item 3.01, moving into closed session.